Okay, so the latest scandal, if you will, the latest political um, event that is characterizing the extreme nature of European politics and the degree to which it is deteriorated. They have just recently, about a week ago, European Parliament voted to no longer consider Hungary as a democracy. Now we have to understand that this vote says that an election in which 65% of the populace, 65, 66% of the populace, almost two-thirds, voted for the FIDESZ party, which is the party of the young Democrats. Um, it's actually the acronym stands for um, Young Democrats Association, and they're in coalition with the Christian Democrat Party of Hungary, and they formed the coalition together. But again, it's they both ran together on these issues, and they agree on everything. So it's not a kind of coalition where there's a lot of disagreement between the partners. They received 66, 67% of the vote, and the European Parliament, along with many other non-government organizations, often funded by left-wing, um, progressive, quote unquote, sources, which all stand for these progressive sources, basically stand for socialist policies, and 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 want to push Europe in a more socialist direction than it has already gone. And they came and they observed these elections, and every one of them stated after the elections that they did not find anything wrong with the way the elections were run. Nevertheless, the European Parliament decided to make this vote. And the reasons they gave are that Hungary is authoritarian. Why? Because it has passed laws, including, including, including ones based on referendums. They did a referendum for particularly about the way that children should be taught in the schools and whether they should be taught about uh, uh, various genders and all kinds of other stuff. And that the European Parliament is also pushing, just like our leftists and socialists are pushing here in the United States. Uh, um, so they passed these laws that declare such controversial matters as a family that consists of a man, a woman, and children. That's controversial according to the European Parliament. In other words, you cannot identify what we call traditional families anymore because you have to somehow or other specify that a family can be any kind of combination, not necessarily involving a man, a woman, and a child. Now, Hungarians passed a law that said that as far as they're concerned, that's what a family is. If somebody else wants to have a family composed of some other combination of human beings, that's not against the law in Hungary. It's just that it's not technically a traditional family. It's a different form of an arrangement. Um, and also, the other big thing that the European Parliament hates and despises is that Hungary does not allow the free movement of illegal migrants or immigrants. They're in this case migrants because they're migrating from the Near East and sometimes even from Africa, but they don't go through Hungary, they go through Italy. Um, they don't allow this. They say that if you want to come into the country, and if you want to go to another country, even if you don't want to stay in Hungary, you have to have some sort of document that says who you are, where you come from, where you're going. In other words, a passport or some sort of a document attesting to your uh, uh, citizenship or the country that you come from and your destination and so forth. So a legal document. Because Hungary requires that and has built a fence to prevent the migrants that are now coming by the hundreds of thousands again. This past year in Hungary, they've already stopped since the beginning of the year, and now we're only in the 9th month. They've already stopped more than quite a few more than 100,000, a couple 100,000 people. So that's the other reason. So these are the primary reasons that they gave for not considering Hungary a democracy. Now, the representative that's critical, representative who was most critical of the in the hearings on the European Commission, which is the sort of executive body of the European Union, they recommended that the above censure be voted by the parliament, including the left-wing socialist and ex-communist Hungarian members who represent the shrinking opposition in Hungary. By the way, they're so small now that the biggest party, the Democrat, I can't. DK is the Hungarian abbreviation. I just can't think of the Democratic Commission or something like that. I don't know the exact name of the other one. They consist of basically around 10-12% of the electorate that voted for him. That's the party. That's the biggest party. The other ones are smaller. There's some of them are as small as 1% or 2%. These people, and they're all, well, interestingly enough, not only leftists. One or two of them are far right-wing parties. They are the opposition in Hungary. So these are the people that in the European Parliament always vote against Hungary, particularly, and this is the interesting thing, this is what's behind all this declaring Hungary not to be a true democracy, that they do not want to give Hungary the funds that are due to the country to alleviate the problems that were caused by the pandemic. And this money was actually a loan that the European Union voted for everybody to pay or borrow, all the members of the European Union, including Hungary. So their share of this loan is what they're not giving to Hungary because they say that Hungary is not a democracy. Okay, and as a result, what that amounts to is Hungary still has to repay the loan because, of course, the European Union as a whole agreed to borrow this money to help out the people with the governments with the pandemic, all the different governments in Europe. They're not going to get the money, but they have to pay the interest and the money to repay the loan. That's in a nutshell a pretty interesting twist. So the problem here is that this is in a larger context. This is a situation in Europe, which finds itself. It shows how misplaced the priorities of these supranational institutions are. Their relevance, especially after the British departure, is completely being questioned in many other countries like Holland and Italy and Poland and now even Sweden. Many of these places, the Polish government is already pretty conservative. It's in agreement on everything with Hungary except on its position with respect to the Russian-Ukrainian war, because the Poles are 100% behind the Ukrainians for various historical reasons, and because of their fear of the Russians is different than the fear of the Hungarians, because the Poles are much bigger and they have been historically more abused by the Russians. Not that the Hungarians haven't been, but the Hungarians have not been as prominently abused. Let's put it this way. Okay, Hungary lost one of its wars against Austria, the war in 1849 for the independence of the country, because the Russian Tsar came in to help defeat the Hungarians. So it's not that the Hungarians don't have any fear of the Russians, but they're being much more realistic. The countries like Poland, they're basically responding emotionally, which is completely understandable, but they're responding emotionally to the Russians because they see the Russians as a threat to the freedom and the security of everybody in Eastern Europe. And there's something to it. Nobody's questioning that. But the point is that these countries, like Poland, like Holland, like now Sweden, that is voting in the first conservative government, looks like in many decades. In Italy, where the conservatives look like they're going to be winning, and nobody knows exactly how many other places are going to happen that the conservative governments are going to come in, who will try to get rid of all these green parties and all these socialists who basically are the reasons why Europe is in so much trouble. Okay, it turns out that Europeans, and by the way, just for those of us who are not familiar, because we live in this wonderful country, especially in the Philadelphia, New York, Washington area, that we don't have to worry about winter until about November. Okay, it doesn't start getting cold, at least in Philadelphia and in New York and Washington D.C. until November, sometimes even later. Boston, New England, up around the Great Lakes, of course, it gets much colder much quicker. And the Europeans are much more like the Boston area and up in the north of the United States because they are on the same latitude. So it starts getting cold. Interestingly enough, the first snows have already fallen in the Alps. So that's an indication of how cold it is already in Europe. And I lived there for many years in the 1980s, 1970s, and the 1980s. And I remember distinctly riding my bicycle to work and having to wear gloves in September, because if I didn't wear gloves, my hands would start hurting from the cold, and sort of a rheumatic response to the cold weather. Anyway, so now in on this continent, because these brilliant European leaders of the European Union voted all of these sanctions against the Russian oil and gas, and the Russians, of course, simply turned it off, so they're not getting any. They're going to be in big trouble as far as being able to heat their homes. They're now, at the moment, already requiring that public buildings in Germany and other places cannot be heated above 67, 68 degrees during the winter. And that's just now. What it's going to be like later, nobody knows. It might be down to 60 degrees by the time they start really feeling the pinch of the lack of fuel. So these people, these are the ones that made these recommendations, and they did these without much discussion. The number of delegates present at the initial debate of the European Commission about Hungary's democratic status was in the 20s. But when it came to time to vote, the number of people that voted, almost all the 705 members of the commission were present. Okay, so that is not indicative of a widespread and well-considered debate. I'm not sure. I might be wrong. The 705 might be actually the parliament, not the commission. Sorry, I didn't mean to confuse. The 705 members were actually the parliament. In any case, the point is that the 20 people that were in discussion was nowhere near compared to the 705 that ended up voting. So when you hear the statements by the Green Party representatives, of course, the Green Party representatives, you have to understand, in Europe, the Green Party is it's another name, another color, but they're basically Marxists. There's no difference between them and the Marxists, Leninists of the 1920s and 1930s, who ended up setting up communist dictatorships all over Europe, but of course, especially in the Soviet Union and Eastern Europe. These brilliant Greens, they in Germany succeeded in closing down 14 of the 17 nuclear power plants. Okay, 14 of the 17 nuclear power plants. Now, that means that Germany, whose economy is in terrible trouble, there are many companies that are already cutting back, closing their factories, laying off people. It's already causing a lot of anxiety problems, certainly political problems in Germany, which has usually been pretty stable. These Greens, because they shut these 14 nuclear power plants down, guaranteed that there was no other source of energy or power for the factories, and of course ultimately for the population, than gas or oil or coal. But of course they don't want to have coal because coal is the worst of all because it's environmentally so terrible. Okay, so as a result, Germany was almost completely dependent on the fuel coming from the Russian east. They had two gas pipelines, one of which was never used because when the Russians invaded Ukraine, one of the first things that the German parliament did was they shut off the new pipeline, the second pipeline that would have bought the gas from Russia. So it turns out that Germany is going to be in these dire straits because of these 14 power plants missing. By contrast, it's interesting, the French have somewhere in the neighborhood of well over 30 or 40, maybe even 50, I don't remember the exact number, nuclear power plants. France is the largest nuclear power plant using country in all of Europe. That includes, even in comparison to the Ukraine and Russia, nobody has as many nuclear power plants. And as a result, the French are not worried about their energy, certainly for the homes, because they're going to have plenty of electricity to keep the homes heated and properly taken care of during the wintertime. They have other problems because they did use gas and oil, mainly gas, for industrial uses, and it's already causing problems in many of the industrial companies in France. Anyway, so the thing that is interesting that these Greens, the way they speak is not that different from the way the communists and their agents spoke in Eastern Europe. In order to understand what I'm talking about, you have to have a little bit of historical background. When the Soviet Army invaded Poland, the Czechoslovak Republic, Hungary, Romania, Bulgaria, and Albania too. Yugoslavia was a little bit different. The Russians didn't go in there, but the Soviets didn't go in there. But when they invaded these countries, they eventually installed communist governments in all of them. Okay, in some places, such as Poland and the Czechoslovak Republic and even Hungary, they went to the extreme of actually killing people, sometimes imprisoning them, like they did with some of the Hungarian politicians and the Social Democrats in Hungary. But in the case of Czechoslovakia, the most famous case, the son of Thomas Masaryk, Thomas Masaryk, who was the first prime minister of the Czechoslovak Republic, his son, Jan Masaryk, was shoved off a balcony. He was the the foreign minister of the Czechoslovak Republic after the war in 1948. This happened, and he called it a suicide. Of course, it's always conveniently a suicide. And the Russians are still doing this, by the way, because if anybody has paid any attention, it turns out that now the oligarchs are all of a sudden committing suicide, one after the other. Something like 2 or 3 of them have already committed suicide in the last couple of months. Interesting. Another thing that hasn't changed much. Maybe the form of government changed, and Putin is no communist, but he's certainly a Russian dictator. And he does things the way that Russian dictators have done since the time of, well before Peter the Great. Ivan the Terrible was the first one And it's not a coincidence that he's called terrible. He was a monster. He killed many, many people in the process of ruling and consolidating what eventually became modern Russia. Anyway, these Greens are doing and are using the same kind of rhetoric based on nothing but false facts. There is no fact, nothing that can be checked properly, that can be scientifically or intelligently observed, that they are saying. For example, their absurd opposition to nuclear power is all based on this ridiculous fear of what happened at 3 Mile Island in Pennsylvania, and then what happened in Chernobyl in the Ukraine in the 1980s, not long after Gorbachev became the head of the Communist Party in the first secretary of the Communist Party in the Soviet Union. So those are the things that they're, and of course the accident in Japan, the Fukushima, I can't remember the exact name. That's the other one that they always bring up as these terrible, terrible dangers. By the way, it turned out that in Japan, the dangers and the problems that they expected to happen because of that accident, which was caused by a tidal wave, okay, it turned out to be nowhere near as bad as the Japanese themselves had forecast. So as the result was that yes, there were quite a few deaths, especially of the people that first went in to try to save the power plant and prevent the nuclear power from spreading and causing more death and destruction. Those people, many of those people died, and there were some other people that died immediately and where even radioactivity affected them. But again, by comparison to some of the other accidents that have happened with other power plants and other sources of energy, these nuclear power plants are by far less dangerous than many of the other things like coal and even gas and oil source of energy can have all kinds of problems. I mean, something could happen. There are often, unfortunately, mistakes are made, and a power plant could have some sort of a disaster, even if it's runs on oil or runs on gas. So to simply single out nuclear power is just ridiculous. It's just not based in facts, especially not since especially after the 3 Mile Island, many engineers all over the world, but particularly in Illinois, where there were lots of nuclear power plants, there still are. I think, if I'm not mistaken, there are at least 8 or 9 nuclear power plants today in Illinois. And in terms of size, Illinois is the second and largest nuclear power producer in the western part of the world after France, or what was is again probably because the Germans shut down all those power plants. Anyway, so they have very smart engineers who worked very hard and made sure, especially after the 3 Mile Island disaster, not even disaster. Again, nobody was radiated. Nobody got hurt after the 3 Mile Island disaster. What happened was the plants had to be closed, but luckily nobody got radioactivity and was hurt by it. So anyway, the point is that these are the same people. They come out with these ridiculous, sloppily researched, often almost unfoundedly absurd facts that they propose or purport to be the case, and they base all of their politics on it. So as a result, what happens is now there are people, some of these green politicians, they say some of the most unbelievable things. The foreign minister of Germany, who's a Green Party member, went to the Ukraine and said that she does not care about what her own people think about energy and about the uses of energy. All she cares about is saving the Ukraine, saving Ukraine. Now, she is the foreign minister of Germany. So she cares more about Ukraine and its war against Russia and saving it from Russia than she cares about her own people and the children that go to school and that have to be in homes. And if they freeze, that's not a problem. As long as her government supports Ukraine in its fight against Russia. It's a little bit, to say the least, a little bit skewed to have that kind of position. Anyway, um, so unfortunately, these people have a lot of money behind them somehow. And again, I'm not wild about conspiracy theories, although sometimes uh, there may not be a conspiracy, but the way that the various interests of large financial groups combine, it looks like it's in a conspiracy. And it's not beyond uh, doubt or beyond a reasonable doubt because you can look at history. And history teaches us that very often people, large financial interests, make terrible, terrible decisions that end up hurting their countries much, much worse than they ever expected. For example, in the German industrialists continued to provide Russia with enormous amounts of resources even after it was taken over by the communists. And they were doing this all throughout the 1920s and 30s, while the Russians, of course, were working as hard as they could to undermine the German, at the time, democratic country. The Germany after the First World War was a social democratic country. It was led by the Social Democratic Party, and the Russians did everything they could, paying a lot of money, helping their communist allies under Rosa Luxemburg and others. There was a whole huge communist party in Germany, and those communists were the ones that were literally fighting with the Nazis in the streets of Germany. So the Russians, while the German industrialists were sending them all kinds of materials and all kinds of technology, making money on, of course, but nevertheless supplying them. These same people, these same Soviet communists, at the same time, were doing everything they could to undermine the German democratic system, and of course, eventually succeeded in pushing the country towards Hitler, and Hitler then made sure that he took over, and he was just as bad as the Soviets could have been and would have been if they had done the same thing. Anyway, so that's what's going on with this with these people. So when the Hungarian government, considering the landlocked country's limitations and its single nuclear power plant, you have to understand what I'm talking about when I'm saying limitations. Since Hungary is landlocked, unlike countries like Poland or Italy or Spain or even France or even Germany, they cannot get fuel at seaports. Yes, liquid natural gas is available, much more expensive, by the way, than the Russian, what used to be the cheap Russian gas. It's not cheap now because the European Union, by imposing the sanctions, succeeded in jacking up the price of the Russian gas. But the liquid natural gas is still more expensive. But it's wonderful that exists, and that may save some European countries from having a terrible winter. Certainly Germany. But Germany's going to have to pay a lot of money to import the liquid natural gas. And so will other countries like Italy and Spain and France, because obviously they can do it with posts. But Hungary doesn't have this option. The Hungarians have not. The only thing they had, and luckily they've had enough sense to use it and to think ahead of time. Hungary has a nuclear power plant that produces roughly about a third, 25% of the energy that they need, especially for electricity. So what they did was they planned, and now they finally have started actually building a second nuclear power plant that will provide more power, but not until 2030. So that's still 8 years away. So they made their provisions many years ago, and they made agreements with the Russians, and they kept to the agreements with the Russians. And by the way, Hungary is one of the few countries of all the European countries at the moment that is still getting natural gas from the Russians. They're coming through southern pipelines, and they're not the only ones. Bulgaria is also getting it, and Serbia and some of the other countries in the Balkans are getting it. This is coming through Turkey, and it's coming from the also from the Russians through the Ukraine. And by the way, there's another pipeline that comes through the Ukraine, but it is also Russian gas. And interestingly enough, in spite of the war, the Ukrainians are still running these pipelines, paying the Russians or getting paid by the Russians for doing it, and the Russians are allowing to do it. So it's another really absurdly crazy situation in the midst of all this war. But the Hungarians had made sure that they did not join all the sanctions against the Russians, and as a result, they're still getting the gas. And because they also had enough sense. And again, this is the reason that it's totally absurd when you talk about they're declared as not being a democracy, because they had enough sense 10 years ago to buy back Hungary's storage capacity for gas. So as a result, the private companies that had literally bought up or got it for cheap, because after the fall of communism, anybody that had any money coming from the West, big corporations were having billions of dollars, it was easy for them to buy up relatively cheaply things like natural gas storage. But the Hungarian government had sense, and this is the same party was ruling the country about 10 years ago, had enough sense to buy back the storage capacity. So now it's owned by the government. As a result, the government has increased and expanded its storage capacity, so much so that Hungary has such a large storage capacity for natural gas that it can even have some excess, possibly, even in such hard times, and is now at the moment is storing some gas for people that don't have as much storage capacity. For example, in Serbia and other places to the south of the country. So this is the country, because it is conservative, because it doesn't go along with the ridiculous, absurd ideas that are being propagated by these left-wing socialist politicians in Europe. It is now declared not to be a democracy. And yet at the same time, the European Union, even though it goes to this extent to not declare it a democracy, it is forced to come to agreements with them, because it looks terribly bad when Hungary, in the estimate of many other countries, not just Poland and the Czech Republic and Slovakia and Romania and other countries that are neighbors, and they know what's going on, and they're all suffering from the same thing that the Hungarians would be suffering from or are suffering from. But even countries like Italy and other countries are coming out and saying that this is absurd. There was an Italian representative of the European Parliament who came out and said that what the vote was a ridiculous farce, and it had nothing to do with reality. It was all a political move. So there are plenty of people, and as things seem to be going in Europe, if they do shift more to the right and you get conservative people coming in, it's going to be a scary thing to see what's going to happen in Europe, because there's going to be a lot of anger and a lot of fury against these crazy, absurd politicians who went along with these programs that end up hurting Europeans more than they ever hurt the Russians. And that is the upshot. That's the whole story about declaring Hungary not to be a democracy. Thank you. That's the end of the story.